Hi everybody, I'm Andy, the Big Andy. Just kidding, happy Halloween! So today, no food recipe. This is the first video of my food photography series where I'll be talking about all the basics of photography that you need to understand to get the perfect shot. In this first video, I'll be talking about the exposure triangle of shutter speed, aperture and ISO, how they work and what they're good for. So stay tuned for that and let's roll the intro. Before we start talking about the exposure triangle, we first must understand what is exposure. So, exposure refers to the amount of light that enters the camera and hits the sensor, or back in the day, the film. So it's basically a measure of how dark or bright a photo is. If it's too bright, it's overexposed. If it's too dark, it's underexposed. Most cameras nowadays allow you to see a visual representation of the exposure using a histogram. Here you can see an example. You'll always have on the left side the shadows, then the midtones, and on the right side you have the highlights. A correctly exposed photo has a good spread between shadows, midtones and highlights. As you can already see in the example, if I change the shutter speed, this affects the histogram and the photo. So let's talk about the shutter speed. The shutter speed refers to the amount of time that the shutter that sits in front of the sensor opens and allows light to hit the sensor. It's usually annotated in seconds or a fraction of a second, like 1/15th of a second, 1/30th of a second, or 1,000th of a second. And while we increase the shutter speed, the image gets darker and darker because less and less light is allowed to hit the sensor. A long exposure, more light; short exposure, less light that's allowed to hit the sensor. And that's basically all you need to know about the shutter speed. But there are a few things you need to consider, especially when shooting handheld. When shooting handheld, you still want to get a nice, crispy, sharp image. And in order to get that, you need to consider the focal length of your lens. So, to get a sharp image in handheld, you need to double the focal length of your lens, and this needs to be the fraction of a second you need to set your shutter speed to. Sounds complicated, but let me explain. So I use a 50mm lens. But since this is an APS-C sensor, which means it's smaller than a full-frame sensor and has a crop factor of 1.5, my 50mm lens is effectively a 75mm lens. So I need to set my shutter speed to at least 1/150th of a second to get a sharp image. As you can see, if I shoot with 1/15th of a second, there's a lot of blur, while if I shoot with 1/160th of a second, it's very nice and sharp. So remember that rule when shooting handheld. But when shooting food, I always advise using a tripod. However, a tripod doesn't necessarily mean a tripod. It can also be a chair or a book, anything that you can put your camera on to stabilize it, allowing you to use a longer shutter speed in case you need more light. But are there other means to get more light? Of course! Let's talk about the aperture. The aperture is a small set of blades that controls how much light will enter the camera. The blades create an octagonal shape that can be widened or closed down to a small hole. If you shoot with the aperture wide open, then more light is allowed to hit the sensor than if the aperture is closed down to only allow a tiny hole of light to enter the camera. The size of the aperture can be adjusted and is measured in f-stops, such as f1.8, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, and so on and so forth. When you change the f-stop value, you change the size of the opening. The higher the f-stop value, the smaller the opening. Example, f1.8 will result in a wider opening compared to f16, which will result in a small opening. Besides controlling how much light hits the sensor, the aperture also controls the depth of field. The depth of field refers to the amount of the image that is sharp. When using a wide aperture, such as f1.8 or 2.8, the depth of field is very shallow. But if you use a narrow aperture, such as f8, 11 or 16, the depth of field is very deep. Here's a little example. If shot with a wide aperture of f1.8 that has a shallow depth of field, only a tiny fraction of the muffin is sharp, while the rest of the image is blurred. If we change the aperture to f8 with the same lighting conditions, you will first notice that the image is much darker compared to the f1.8. This is because the aperture is now much smaller, allowing less light to hit the sensor. If we move the softbox a little closer to get more light on the muffins, you will notice that at f8 there's a deeper depth of field and most of the muffins is in focus. A wide aperture works perfectly for food and portrait photography because it really makes the subject stand out against the blurred background. Let's go back to that image. So imagine you have the shutter speed and aperture set just the way you like it, but the image is still too dark and you can't move a softbox because, for instance, you're working with natural light. Can you still get a perfectly exposed picture? Yes, you can. Let's talk about the ISO. The ISO refers to the gain of the sensor, and by all practical means, it refers to how sensitive the sensor is to light. At low ISO, it's a baseline sensitivity, and with increasing ISO, you increase the sensitivity of the sensor to light. Well, you may ask, why not always use a high ISO? Increasing the ISO always increases the noise, and that has a negative effect on the image quality. As you can see, while I'm increasing the ISO, the image becomes noisier and noisier, and the image quality drops dramatically. So for all practical means, try to work with ISO values as low as possible to get the best image quality. So that's it, all you need to know about the exposure triangle of shutter speed, aperture and ISO and how they work together to get a perfectly exposed image. In brief, if you decrease the shutter speed, meaning you get more light onto the sensor, you can either narrow the aperture or use a lower ISO. The shutter speed affects the motion blur. If you widen the aperture, meaning you get more light onto the sensor, you can either increase the shutter speed or lower the ISO. The aperture affects the depth of field. If you increase the ISO, meaning you increase the sensitivity of the sensor to light, you can either increase the shutter speed or narrow the aperture. The ISO affects the image quality hugely. So that's it. If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. If you want to know more about food photography, let me know in the comments below. And finally, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.